Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Hernandez. I am the deputy food editor here at the Philly Inquirer. Today, I am going to be joined by a wonderful food writer and travel journalist, Kae Lani Palmisano, who is a regular contributor here at Philadelphia Inquirer for our food section. We're going to be covering some of her recent stories, but also her process with researching specifically classic and overlooked foods here in the Philly region. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how to participate today. At any time during the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions to our special guest, Keilani. To do so, please ask your questions in the comment section at the bottom of this page. If you're watching from social media, please visit inquirer.com/Philly Comfort Foods Live to submit your questions. Now that we got that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our guest, Keilani.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Keilani. So before we get started, just a little bit about yourself. You are an Emmy-award winning television host and food and travel writer. You also develop your own recipes. You kind of do it all. You are a host on the very popular Check Please on WHYY, as well as Delishtory. And you have kind of carved a niche for yourself as this lover of like obscure histories. So you must be great at trivia games and fun at parties. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in this?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Like you said, I got my hands on a little bit of everything, but at the core of everything that I do is this yearning for curiosity and for storytelling. And I just happen to connect really deeply to food because food contextualizes so much about our world. It can contextualize kind of the history of a place, people's traditions. I love how food becomes symbolic and it becomes part of people's identities, and people are very passionate about their local foods. And of course, I always admire the people that are also making the food, cultivating the food. And those are the stories that I always kind of gravitate toward. But I kind of got into this through travel writing. And travel is a huge category. It can encompass a lot of things. There's luxury hotels. There's people that just cover cruise lines or railroad lines across the United States. Like, you can get really hardcore into a niche. And when I was first kind of starting out, I didn't know what my niche was until I kind of stumbled into this idea of foodways, the ways in which food kind of moves and migrates, and how different cultures can influence one another. And though history is always written by the people that are in power, you can't necessarily fake a recipe. Recipes will reveal everything. And, so that's kind of what got me into this kind of, like you said, into this niche.
Great. And, I speak for myself. I'm, Chicago boy. So I'm very proud of like Chicago regional foods, and I kind of know my way around them all. You yourself are a Philadelphia native and also have the same kind of connection to place and time and where you live and where you're from. And it seems like you've really carved, a really wonderful place for yourself and really finding out these foods. What kind of drives you to like find these obscure histories, and how do you even get started doing that?
It just like one question leads to another. And I feel like I've only gotten to this place in time after hitting this career path for the past decade at this point. There are sometimes I'll stumble across like an interesting tidbit, or someone will say something in a conversation, or I'll, meet someone who visits Philadelphia and they see something that I didn't necessarily see because I, grew up in this area, and you kind of become almost like not blind, but you don't necessarily see what outsiders might see when they're looking in, because we're insiders and everything. So my research is a mix of loving to read and staying stimulated in the arts too. Sometimes like a television show will trigger a curiosity of mine, and I'll just go, well, how far can I follow this storyline down into a rabbit hole, or a particular body of work, or even a song. So there's always or sometimes like I'll work on a story and then so the stuff that doesn't make it into that story will inevitably like become either like a story that I publish for another publication, or like a follow-up story, or a story for Delistry, because Delistry kind of is me with a green screen kind of talking about really strange, I don't like to say strange, it's just like these forgotten histories, how we got to where we are today and why those moments in history were so pivotal then. And in a way, it's kind of like we because it's become like scrapple. Like I've talked about scrapple, I've talked about banana splits, whoopie pies, things like that. People often forget, where it came from or that it's special. And that's what I like to get people excited, just as excited as I am to explore the history. I want people to get just as excited. So
great. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned Scrapple. You've written quite a number of pieces for us in the recent weeks, specifically the history of Scrapple and its ties to the region. Some really cool stuff about whoopie pies, with Philadelphia versus Maine in this regard, and the banana split. So like some really fun foods that have histories in at least Pennsylvania, if not Philadelphia. So let's start with kind of banana splits. Like how did you even originate that story, and what set you off?
It's just random tidbits that I just pick up through life. Like I don't even remember when I learned that the banana split was from Latrobe. It was just kind of sitting there nestled in the recesses of my brain. And when Megan approached me about, talking about these Philly classics, like I see Philly, I see not just the city, but also just like the region. I interviewed one of the curators at the Seaport Museum, and because Philadelphia was such an important seafaring seaport city, he described it to me as Philadelphia was kind of like the eye of a needle through which the world kind of passed through. So like, just because something might either start in Philadelphia, but it's not necessarily that it always starts in Philadelphia. A lot of things do start in Philadelphia, but like it all kind of like funnels through this region, and then the influence goes out into the rest of the world. So even though the banana split was first created in Latrobe, it was a group of pharmacist friends who actually brought it to Philadelphia, and then it went to Atlantic City, and it just kind of proliferated from there. But the important part about that story that I didn't get to kind of get across is that 1904 is this like super pivotal year, like and the years leading up to it and the years kind of preceding it too are just this type of energy that was kind of percolating at that time that allowed for a lot of competition and a lot of innovation. First off, it's like the banana split being made by a pharmacist. Why were pharmacists involved with ice cream, and why were they so closely tied to soda jerks? Well, that's because, I had an interview from my interview with Ryan from Franklin Fountain. He had told me about that. Well, bubbly water, the soda water, was seen as a kind of having mineralistic properties, or it was mineral water and also had medicinal properties to it. And so it quickly became an offering by pharmacies, and eventually ice cream also kind of got into the mix by I think like the late 1800s. But by the 1900s, there's this like, everyone's trying to one up one another. There's all of these soda fountain contraptions being invented. Everyone's trying to create all of these new recipes. There's flim flam men and traveling salesmen, and everyone's like just trying to compete with one another. And the banana split was kind of part of that competition and innovation. But 1904 in particular, America is hosting the World's Fair in St. Louis. And we're also hosting the very first Summer Olympics that in the United States, also held in St. Louis. And so for the first time in America's history as a country, we're on this global stage, and we need to kind of show off. We need to, show our opulence. And the theme for the St. Louis exposition was the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so So
Sure.
the big thing from Lewis and Clark Expedition was this manifest destiny idea. Like, but, because we had already colonized sea to shining sea, the next frontier was science, technology, innovation, and opulence. And so that's kind of where like all of this energy is happening in the year of 1904. And so another thing was the importance and the symbolism of the ingredients in the banana split. You've got the banana, and the banana was relatively new to Americans at that time. It wasn't something that we started importing until the 1880s. So by 20 years later, it's this kind of popular fruit. There's also a dark side to that history too. 1904 is when the term banana republic gets coined, and it was a writer who was describing how the banana industry had destabilized countries in Central America, and it was kind of in a paper about the exploitation of bananas. So there's that kind of like dark element to it, and how it's not just a banana, it's a global supply chain thing, and what does this mean to people? And then there's also the story of like pineapple sauce, and that's also on a banana split. And for hundreds of years leading up to this point, the pineapple was seen as this super extravagant luxury fruit that was reserved for the wealthy. In fact, there was a Delistry segment about historical food flexes, where it was like all of the ways in which people like to flaunt their wealth through food. And the pineapple is like a huge example, because royalty would put the pineapple on display. It wasn't for eating, it was just for display. And in the colonies, pineapples, there was actually this like rental market for pineapples to display at your parties. And that's why like the pineapple is a motif in a lot of decor. You see it on fabric, you see it etched into furniture. You also see it like, I've seen people's lawn ornaments. So to have so 1904, you have all of this crazy stuff kind of happening in the United States. And then you have this dessert that is two fruits that are new on the American market. Oh, and mind you, the pineapple was first introduced to the United States in 1901, or at least it became more accessible in 1901 by the Dole Company, because they had the Hawaiian Pineapple Company. So it's like all of this was like super new to people, and they were just like really pumped about it.
Well, I mean, like you had kind of mentioned it just a little earlier, but food can be political. It can be about economics. It can be about culture. It can be about a lot of things. And you bring up some really good, interesting points about pineapple sauce. Like that's not really that common anymore. Whereas where are you getting banana splits if you not at a children's birthday party? It's not something that's sold at your neighborhood pharmacy anymore.
Right. Yeah.
But I think that what resonated with me with initially reading your story and editing it was just kind of this sense of American ingenuity. Can you tell us a little bit about how the banana splits popularity spread around this time?
Yeah, around that time.
How did it go from this pharmacy to the world?
Oh yeah. I mean, it starts in this little pharmacy in Latrobe. He was a young, I think a pharmacist apprentice. He might've been only like 22, 23 at the time, and just had all of this I love the term, like the unbridled imagination, which I had used in the story. And he just concocted this, this banana split. And he even then commissioned a glass blower to create the banana boat to serve this thing in. But it was his friends who had come from Philadelphia. They were also pharmacists. They come and visit him. They see this newfangled recipe that he had developed, and they're like, this is the bee's knees, and we need to bring this to, Philadelphia. And because Philadelphia is this metropolitan area where the culture in Philadelphia at that time, and I still believe these days, culture in Philadelphia influences everything else around it. It just becomes this like, oh, we need to also have this banana split on our menus, and it kind of proliferated from there.
Cool. From the banana split, let's move over to whoopie pies.
Okay.
For those who are unfamiliar with your story, can you tell us a little bit about what a whoopie pie is and some of the controversy about its origins?
Yes. Okay. So a whoopie pie. I grew up with the story, and I think a lot of people in this region grew up with the story that it was a Pennsylvania Dutch creation, that they would have excess cake batter, and to use up that cake batter, because they're very much a waste not, want not kind of group of people, they bake these little cake discs, and then they create a cream and they put them together. And I think there's a couple of stories. It's either when they were in the oven kind of baking, they would go whoopee, or when kids found it in their lunch, the kids would say whoopee. So that's, like they bake these whoopie pies, and, I don't know how it works, but like the consistency of the cream is not necessarily like a buttercream icing, though some of the creams are buttercream. It somehow suspends the two cake discs perfectly. And I don't know how they don't smush together, or but it's light. You think it's going to be like a lot of cake, and it's very sweet, but it's perfect bite every single time. And it's also a perfect little serving. But, I think it was around the early 2000s, like Philadelphia's like, yep, Pennsylvania Dutch created the whoopie pie. Maine comes in and they're like, well, we're going to declare the whoopie pie to be our
state
official
dessert, right?
Yeah, our official state dessert. And people in the region were just like bewildered.
The audacity.
Yeah, but lo and behold, they did have, I forget which bakery it was, had some kind of copyright or patent, or there was an advertisement that had been run that was like, oh, this bakery has whoopie pies. And, it shook a lot of people up. And it kind of begs the question of like, is something officially created when there is some type of like documentation, whether it be like a patent or a copyright, or someone runs an advertisement, when it's almost like people need this like physical proof, when in reality it's like the like whoopie pie like desserts probably existed for way longer. I think there were also, this didn't make it into the story, but there was also questions of whether or not this was another German dessert that made its way over to the United States, because such desserts also exist in Europe. But then kind of to throw a wrench in Maine's wheels, Pittsburgh comes out and they're like, no, we've had gobs since the early 1900s, and gobs, like I would have never known what a gob is, even though it's the same state, like it's Pennsylvania. You go to the western part of it, whoopie pies suddenly turn into gobs. But it was, one of the bakers that I had interviewed for that story who was like, oh yeah, gobs. And I'd never heard of it. But sure enough, I found these very charming newsreels and videos of a gob festival that they had a couple years ago. And it was kind of cute to see just how the Mid-Atlantic really loves this dessert.
So do gobs have the same like Pennsylvania Dutch origins as whoopie pies, or did they somehow kind of develop independently?
It's hard to tell, and it's hard to say, because then there's also whoopie pie like desserts further out west in other Pennsylvania Dutch groups, like going out to like Illinois and also Ohio and everything. And so people thought, was it some type of migration of those Dutch coming to our region? So it's kind of hard to say exactly where it was developed, but the gob story kind of put Pennsylvania back on the map as like a contender for the originator of the whoopie pie.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We both do research on origins of things for a lot, and you can't always find the first thing ever, right? Like, I don't know about you.
Oh yeah, no, it's usually there's some kind of precursor. Everything kind of influences everything. It's very rare when something just occurs out of nowhere. Like the banana split might be like, but it's not, it's like because you brought in a bunch of ingredients and kind of put it all into one banana boat.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I wanted to read this comment or this question from a reader.
Yes.
As a newbie to the city, I'm not too familiar with places to get great whoopie pies. But what's your favorite flavor, and who in Philly do you does them best, or what's your favorite? Like, where do you go? Where would you
Oh
suggest?
my, this is good. I think the classic is always like a chocolate one. I grew up getting them at the Berlin Farmers Market, which made it onto the list. They are a Mennonite family that found their way to the Berlin Farmers Market, where they have like three kinds. There's a chocolate. Did they have a vanilla? I forget. And then there was like a chocolate chip cookie one, which was almost like a cookie sandwich. But the chocolate's classic. That was the one where the cream like kind of blew my mind. I was like, these discs are like magnets and the opposing poles, and they won't smush together. That was a cream that defied logic. But right now, there is Crocus Bakery. She mostly does some of the farmers markets. So you can find her on Saturdays at Rittenhouse and Dickinson's farmers market on Sundays. And then sometimes Rye Bread stocks her pastries, but they're all vegan. She has found a way to create, and she comes from a Pennsylvania Dutch heritage. So she makes all of these Pennsylvania like homely dishes, all vegan, but she makes these whoopie pies. And so she's always got a classic chocolate, but she also has this monthly rotation where I think at one point she had blueberry cake with like a lemon verbena cream. She had like apricots. Oh yeah, they're very fancy, but they're delicious. The flavor combinations are outrageous.
I don't know. This might be showing my ignorance, but is there a right way and a wrong way to eat a whoopie pie? Do you eat it like an Oreo, like splitting it up, or do you have to just like go for it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I say follow your bliss. Like, it depends. Like, I eat Oreos many a different way.
Sure.
It kind of reminds me of the old Reese's cup commercial. Like, people have told me that the way I eat the Reese's cup is always wrong, which probably it is. I nibble the chocolate off and then I eat the peanut butter. Which I guess you can eat a whoopie pie like that too. But
sure.
but at least get one bite that is the cream with the cake.
Sure.
The texture and the flavors together are
the
really
elusive
good.
Perfect bite, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about the sweets that you have covered. Let's go to the savories. Let's start with the more controversial. I feel like, again, I'm new to the city, but I feel like many people in the region either love or hate scrapple. And I was I loved your piece, just the history of how, it comes from butchery traditions. And it's, again, kind of to repeat the theme of whoopie pies is waste not, want not. But we have all of these extra materials from the animals that we have butchered. What do we do with it? And it seems like it was a product that was created out of necessity, but also sustenance and nurturing, which I always like. I hate food waste. So can you tell us a little bit about scrapple and why you thought that you needed to write this story? It seems like, everybody knows what scrapple is. Like, why now? Why would you,
I'm honored because like Scrapple, that story was sitting in my brain for 3 years. So talk about like when, and I just read about, I read about food every now and again, but 3 years ago, I really was bored and decided to do this deep dive into the Philadelphia Inquirer's archives, because I wanted to see what were people saying about scrapple like 100 years ago? What were people saying about scrapple 200 years ago? And you can get pretty far back in the Inquirer archives with some of the very old scrapple stories and old scrapple recipes that used to hit the newspaper and everything. And I wanted to see, were people talking about scrapple in kind of the same way? In Amy Strauss's book about Pennsylvania scrapple, she talks about this occurrence called the Scrapple correspondence of 1872, which happened in the New York Times, to the letters to the editors section. Someone wrote in this story about like how to save money and how not to waste things around the household, and they waxed poetically about their love of Scrapple. But what it did was it sparked this flurry in the letters to the editors section of the New York Times for like weeks on end, and people were just like bickering back at one another, but it was like a very slow Reddit thread. So and people mailed in, they had these like little usernames. They like Blue Bonnet was like, oh, it's abominable, you should just eat like oatmeal instead, which what oatmeal versus Scrapple, that's wild.
They're different things. And it sounds like just olden times Twitter, just the discourse.
Yeah, it really was. There was like, someone was like, oh, you bet, like, here's how to not over fry it. You don't want to over fry it. But there's a line in the Scrapple piece that people really loved and they really picked up, which was the pate of the people. And that line actually was inspired by one of the I'm going to call them comments. One of the comments in this letters to the editor section from 1872. It was by physician, and I got to read this because I don't want to mess it up.
Yeah.
He or she called themselves physician, and they wrote that Scrapple was a, quote, positive luxury, throwing the Frenchman's pâté de foie gras entirely into the shade. And I just like loved that this was like throwing shade.
Yeah.
And
oh my gosh.
It was great. But I wanted to see if there was like similar rumblings of like Scrapple in the Philadelphia Inquirer. So like I came across this story. It was from 1947. It's 1947, and there's this headline on the front of the Inquirer that day about tensions rising between the USSR and the United States. So already the Cold War is beginning to brew. But in the lower left-hand corner, there's another Cold War brewing, and it's about undercooked Scrapple at the State Teachers College in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. So what had happened was 550 students like stormed out of the dining hall in this mass protest over how bad the food was at this school. Oh, no. And so the article was like, yo, what sparked this flurry, this madness, this strike? And the student came forward and was like, that meal tonight was the climax. We had cold and underdone Scrapple for dinner, and you can't eat raw eggs. Like, that was the quote. So the students, like, they storm out of the school, they march into town, and they're chanting, K rations were better than this, which K rations were like one of the rations kits that you would get depending on whatever theater you were fighting in. But this sounds super funny, but like I saw it, and mind you, the Inquirer followed up on this story for months afterward. Like it was called the Scrapple strike. And like, really, it sounds funny now, but you kind of have to understand what was going on at the time. Like, it's a story about life after World War II. And it's the first couple of semesters after everybody comes home from the war, and they're trying to, go to school and start their lives over on the GI Bill. And then the schools are over inundated with students. I think the school justified the bad food by saying that the cost of food went up 200% that semester. And like, people just wanted to take up the government's offer on that schooling, and they couldn't even get, like, it wasn't working out the way that they had expected. And they couldn't even get good Scrapple. So I felt for them, but it was that was a funny story. But yeah, there always seemed to be this, like, intensity, the intense feelings over Scrapple.
Yeah. Before we continue, I have more questions for you, but I just wanted to invite the audience to submit your questions. We'll have some time to answer. Ask Keilani anything about what we're talking about or her work. And to talk about that, to circle back to Scrapple's kind of polarity, why do you think it is that so many people have a good or bad opinion about it? It's either super comfort food or just something that people poo-poo.
And that's kind of funny. It's just like, I think a lot of people eat scrapple,
Yeah.
but it is kind of seen, as like you had mentioned, it's a butchering tradition, and it's a dish that's meant to be made in small batches, because it is made with the excess meats. Like there's only so much pig's head and feet you can kind of get your hands on. So I know that we had a discussion off camera about like the recipe kind of changing when it becomes mass produced. So like, big names like the Habersats, as amazing and delicious as it is, it's mass produced. So they have to bulk out their recipe with more conventional cuts of pork, like pork loin, pork shoulder. Yes, it does have the other cuts of meat as well, but I really love that there are producers these days who are going back to making small batch scrapple. They're going back to like Elwood. He makes both a pork scrapple and a venison scrapple. And you've got Stockyard. They also make, and of course Primal Meats. Primal Supply. They also make scrapple, and I like that it's kind of almost returning back to kind of what it was before it got industrialized.
Yeah, in many ways, scrapple is one of those ingredients and products that was originally farm to table in the purest sense, right?
Yes,
is
definitely.
that accurate?
Oh yeah. I mean, it was your farm to your table a lot, because it was basically like, even Adam Dillitz, like he told me a story which I wish I could have included more in the article, but he grew up with the family tradition of them taking a hog from their farm and slaughtering it either anywhere between Christmas and New Year's, and it was like a wintertime thing. Something that was kind of fatty and salty, that kind of satisfied a lot of cravings, that had a great shelf life, that you could eat throughout the duration of the winter. And it is like, I know we eat it all year round, but if you think of it in a seasonal context, it's like, why are we eating such heavy meat in the summertime?
Right. That's a really good point. One of your other stories is on tomato pie,
Yes.
which some people, I come from a pizza city, and people like to bag on Chicago's deep dish. Would people also do the same with tomato pie? Wouldn't you just call that pizza? I'm being controversial. I know the answer to that, but I want to hear it from you.
Oh man. So kind of what I said at the beginning, when I said that, like, sometimes you become almost like a little bit blind to the things that you're so familiar with. They're part of your everyday life. And tomato pie was actually one of those things that I didn't realize was not a national thing until a couple of years ago, when someone told me about Rhode Island's pizza strips. And which is exactly like tomato pie, only it's cut into thin strips. And they wrap it in like plastic, and then you kind of like, it's at the register and you can kind of pay for it, grab and go. And someone told me about this, and I was like, what do you mean pizza strips? This is tomato pie, which led me to realize, like, wow, that was one of those dishes that I just thought was everywhere. But yeah, it's of course an Italian dish or Italian American dish that was brought, the concept for it brought over by Italian immigrants who mostly settled around the Italian market area. And a lot of the bakeries, again, to use up excess pizza dough, or not pizza dough, but rather bread dough, like they were making Italian rolls. To use up the excess dough, they were making tomato pie. And it's a little bit like a focaccia. It kind of is also kind of reminiscent of like, the like Sicilian style bread, because it's like very, and it's got fluffy, like a nice crust. It's fluffy, it's airy, but the whole process, it seems so simple. Like, dough is only a few ingredients, and then tomatoes, like a good tomato sauce, is only a few ingredients. But there's a process, like how long the dough has to ferment, and then it's not just the process of baking it. You have to bake it like a couple of times, like once with sauce and once with more sauce. And, that whole process kind of amazed me. And I also really love when the flavor of something is altered by the quality of the ingredients that you're using, or perhaps the flavor of the dough is altered by letting it, ferment a little bit longer. And in everyone that I had talked to for that story, they all had like similar stories of like I loved, his name is Pizza Gut on Instagram, Daniel Gutter, who does circles and squares. He was like, oh, it's the first time. I don't even remember really the first time, but I just know that it was what this kid would bring to every week to when they played hockey, street hockey. And other people were like, oh, I always had this at like birthday parties or Sunday. It was like the church pie. There's a few tomato pie places that are by churches and people would get it after church. So it's like, I love people's memories, like their childhood memories kind of also fold into this. And
and even you mentioning that using up leftover dough, and it kind of goes back to the theme of like just ingenuity with leftover ingredients and how do you stretch a dollar. Is there something to be said about kind of the scrappiness of Philadelphia and its people, and like how to why that seems to be a common theme.
Yes. Yeah. I'm so glad because Philadelphia has a long history of welcoming, immigrant groups to the city, and we still do. And, when people come here, they bring with them their culture, their stories, and of course, like their food. And, when you're making long journeys like that, the food has to be resilient, as are the cultures are very resilient. And so I think like Philadelphia just has this like long history of, being able to come here, start anew, finding good communities. Like Philadelphia is a very block by block city. The communities are very tight knit and close together, and that is kind of a recurring theme. I love I didn't do pretzels for I didn't do pretzels yet for the Inquirer, but I always like to say that like Philadelphians are like a Philadelphia pretzel. We're like soft on the inside, a little salty and crusty on the outside.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I have one question here, and I don't know the answer to this, so maybe you do, and maybe it's a future story idea. But snapper soup, is that a Philly thing? Did restaurants really use snapper, or did they sometimes substitute beef? I'm not really sure. I'm not familiar with this dish.
Oh, yeah. Well, I did do a story about snapper soup for KitchenAid, has like a journalist project. And so I kind of did this deep dive because, again, I grew up like, being with a family that would like catch snappers off the side of the road in the Pine Barrens and drop them off at a diner and get some snapper soup afterwards. So it's like, I thought that this was like a really like local thing, but the dish, it's kind of like it has like a little bit of a French influence, but then you get that, European influence meets indigenous ingredients to our region. And I think now we're on like the terrapin, but in our history, it started out with green sea turtles, and they were almost, because of people's love of snapper soup, like they were almost like caught to extinction. So they they had to like switch over to another type of turtle that was indigenous to the Americas, like mostly the mid-Atlantic. So you've got like different variations of snapper soups, and snapper soup was actually a thing that African Americans would make. And that's, again, like another dish that kind of is made by a group of people, and then it just kind of bubbles up and becomes something that is fancy. Like it goes through like all of these iterations of being like a poor man's dish and then like very fancy and wealthy. I think like in one point in my research there was like a snapper soup society in New York City. And like so the dish is like enjoyed all the way up to New York, all the way down to even Louisiana. They have some turtle soup. It's not snapper soup. It's a turtle soup. But
I've actually heard of turtle soup in New Orleans for sure.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a dish that exists in other places. But again, it's one of those things that I think there is a particular Fishtown style or was it, it's either Fishtown or Kensington,
Mm.
but Elwood, Adam makes it. And I think what makes it uniquely Philadelphian is that little shot of sherry that we like to put in it in this region. Although I know they put it in the turtle soup in New Orleans too, right?
Yeah, correct.
So that one needs to be explored a little
They're
bit.
probably related in some way.
Yeah, probably.
I have a question. So about your research process from a viewer.
Yes.
Do you hole up in libraries for fact-finding endeavors, or what's kind of your ratio between traveling by foot, getting people on the phone? Like, what's your research process?
I love bouncing ideas off of people. So it's as informal as just chatting to chefs or chatting to other people about foods that they grew up with and foods that they really love. And when you ask someone about foods that they love, they get into it. And that's what I like. I just kind of love to follow like their gut. And I follow my gut with all of my stories. I love following people's passions. It's also like diving into archives. I love like with the scrapple story, I had taken a deep dive years ago into the Philadelphia Inquirer like archives, which by the way, I did forget to mention that like it looks like every 20 or 30 years the Inquirer runs a scrapple story and we're on time. So I'm very proud to be this generation's like scrapple writer. But anyway, sometimes it's as informal as just like I'm following my own interests and I'm literally just doing it because it's almost like my hobby. And then once the story becomes a little bit more secured, or if I need to do more pre-reporting, I will go to like libraries are a great resource. I also love going to antique shops and checking out community cookbooks, or like buying old cookbooks and everything. But the community cookbooks, the ones that are like, Haddon Township High School Mom's PTA 1974 cookbook. Like you will find some like really good like family recipes, things that are very specific to like either that family or that time.
We're very similar in that regard. I really love collecting old church cookbooks because they really tell you a history of the community and who was cooking and how they were cooking. And, here's Mima's lemon cake recipe, or, here's Susie Q's, like hot dog salad.
Yes.
So I also love just flipping through a church cookbook because they're just so enlightening and interesting. And I think of always, who cooked this and why and who are they cooking for? I always think of that,
Oh, definitely. Yeah. So that's usually how I roll. I love the Free Library. I mean, that's how I dive into a lot of archives. They have so much stuff. And membership is free, so support the library.
Yeah. So, you're a lady about town. You do a lot of research and you're on WHYY's Check Please and Delicistory. We have a viewer asking for what did you win your Emmy? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, it was a program host moderator in 2020 for my hosting of Check Please Philly. And the show itself also got 2 nominations, one for lifestyle and another one for entertainment. So very proud of the team on their first year, doing the show. So
first year and obviously the pandemic has thrown a wrench in a lot of programming. What do you expect to see next for that program?
Well, hopefully we'll be able to bring it back maybe like next year. We just want things to kind of settle down and become as normal as possible, just because it takes a lot of resources to also, we're coordinating 3 restaurants per episode and 3 guests come to the show. And it's a very sociable experience, which like we haven't been able to get like too close to people in some time now. But, we've worked on other projects throughout the pandemic, one of which was Delicistory, which is, was a chance for me to kind of showcase my weird and quirky knowledge, which I don't think people would know that I am a huge nerd had Delistry not happened. I mean, there's little moments in Check Please where you can really see how nerdy I am, but it's on full display in Delistry. And I'll also be filming some other restaurant segments for them in the coming months. So that'll air on their You Wanna Know program. So we're still, taking into account, the changes that are happening in the restaurant industry, and then also celebrating, the good that has also come out of it.
Great. Yeah. And I love Check Please as a brand, having seen it for years in Chicago. And a viewer is asking, do you know other Check Please hosts in other cities, and do you compare notes, or are you trying to figure out, carve your own space?
I am maybe too shy to approach the fantastic
I don't believe
people that host the show. But I mean, I follow them on social media, interacted just remotely. I haven't met them in person yet. But Leslie Sabraco for San Francisco Bay Area was kind of who I watched a lot of the show when I was asked to audition for it. That was the one that I had watched, just to see how she kind of runs it. And of course, Alpana. Alpana for Chicago, of course, because that's where the show started out. Just watching them and seeing, what types of questions do they ask, and but I don't know, when you're sitting around the table with three people, all of a sudden you forget that the cameras are there. Everyone's got wine, so you're also a little loosened up, and you just start to have a normal conversation.
Great. And I know we're running low on time, but what's before we sign off, can you tell us a little bit about what's your next thing catching your curiosity that you want to chase down, and if you can tell us that'd be wonderful.
Sure. The concept of protected, what was it? PDOs, like the foods that are destinations in and of themselves, and how do they get that classification, and what's, like the most popular one is, champagne can only come from the Champagne region. People say that. It's like, well, what goes into that, and what goes into that process, or finding other foods of that caliber around the world. Cause I love this idea that it's like, you can only get like Florida oranges in Florida, or like you can only get port wine in Portugal,
Right. Cheese is a big one, I'm sure.
There's so much cheese drama.
So before we sign off, can you let our viewers know where they can find you and your work?
Yeah, well, I'm a little all over the place. You can definitely watch me on WHYY on Check Please and Delistry. You can, I think like a great landing pad is my own personal Twitter and my personal Instagram. That's kind of where I will post everything that I'm working on and everything that I'm doing. It's also a great place to see the process and the behind the scenes, a little bit of all the things that I'm working on. But I also have a newsletter and a podcast called Amuse Bouche. It's on Substack, but that's also kind of where I distribute the podcast as well. But you can also find the podcast on Apple, iTunes, and Spotify, and all of the places where you normally listen to podcasts. So
great.
Catch me on a lot of places on the internet.
Yeah, I will just personally vouch for how great your Substack is. You're really generous about your process, and your Instagram stories are always really fun because you're always talking to fun people, and you are very effusive and generous about your knowledge and where you share things. So I highly recommend following Keilani on those platforms.
Thank you so much.
With that said, I am Joseph Hernandez, and I am the Deputy Food Editor here at the Philly Inquirer. Thank you all for joining us today on this really fun chat. And Keilani, thank you for letting me pick your brain.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I had a great time.
Bye, everyone.